What is money? How does it work? Why do we need it? What is its function? That is what this video is going to be about. And of course, we're talking about these questions in relation to the book written by Dr. Saifedean Ammous, The Bitcoin Standard. And we're trying to understand his way of thinking in his book on this topic so we can finally, in the end, understand Bitcoin. I read something on Twitter the other day by Vitai Slade, and this really hit me. He said, I think the majority don't understand Bitcoin because they don't understand money. They know how to use it or trade their labor for it, but that's about it. When I read that, I realized that's absolutely true for me. Like, until I read this book, I barely ever thought before about, well, how does money come about? How is it used? What is money? What defines money? What are its functions and what separates it to other forms of exchange? All these kind of questions, I never really thought about it. If you're not in an economics background, then you probably don't think about it like that. But interestingly enough, when I listened to the first talks Dr. Saifedean Ammous gave, he always started his talks not talking about Bitcoin or the crypto space, but talking about money and explaining how it works. So later he can build on that knowledge to explain why Bitcoin could possibly become very, very valuable. So I want to start with how he starts in the book and just explain some of his ideas about money and how he starts his conversation. So basically the first starting point is, well, can't we just keep exchanging goods, like trading, I don't know, you need some 5 apples, so I'm just going to give you 5 of my I don't know, salads that grow in the garden or something. Can we just do barter? So this basically direct, immediate exchange. And I actually thought about that before. I thought, well, why not go back to that someday? Isn't that so bad? And he says, well, the problem with direct exchange is threefold. And these problems boil down to something called a lack of coincidence. So basically, there's a buyer and there's a seller, and they need to have certain things in common. But if there's a lack of coincidence in different aspects, and he names 3, then there's a problem with direct exchange. So the first one is the lack of coincidence in scales. So if you want to buy a house, but the only thing you have to give are shoes, it's really difficult to break down a house in shoes. So you need to know, like, okay, do I give you like 20,000 shoes, and what does this guy do with 20,000 shoes? So it's very difficult to scale with direct exchange when you have like goods that don't really match up. The second point is the lack of coincidence in time frames. So it could happen that you have a good to trade, which is maybe, I don't know, oranges, but you want to buy something like a car with it. And of course it's difficult because your oranges won't last very long in comparison to the car. So the two things are very hard to compare, and your oranges are eventually going to rot, although you might have a lot right now. So there's a lack of coincidence in time. And then the third one is a lack of coincidence in location. So of course it could happen that there's a buyer and a seller, but you have a house in, I don't know, let's say New York, and you want to sell this house to buy a house in, I don't know, Los Angeles. But the guy in Los Angeles, of course, doesn't care about the house in New York because he can't really do anything with it. So there's a problem with like just exchanging goods directly. And I think it's really interesting how he approaches the whole topic of money, that he says, well, we need to think about the problem money tries to solve. So he comes from an engineering background, saying that it's all about the functional essence of things. So you need to understand the problems that things try to solve. And so money actually tries to solve a problem, and the problem is exactly that which has been outlined by the direct exchange. The direct exchange is hugely impractical. That's why virtually if there's any other way around it, it actually doesn't happen because it's so impractical. So something evolves out of this situation, out of this problem, out of this impracticality, and it is something called a medium of exchange. You need something that you can agree with. We're just going to use this thing, this good, this monetary device, so we can actually do business with each other without directly exchanging goods for the outlined problems before. So there is the first function of money, it's just used as a medium of exchange. So it's not bought for reasons of being consumed. That would be the other one, like consumption goods. You don't buy money to actually do you something good, and you don't buy it for investment. So you don't buy it so you can use money to produce other goods with it later on, but you actually buy money only in order to exchange it and use it for exchange. So it's a medium of exchange. That's the first function. And so Dr. Ammous is a lot into Austrian economics, and he writes that the father of Austrian economics is Karl Menger. I have no idea, but that's what I learned. And he says that this Karl Menger said that the key property that leads to a good being adopted freely as money on market is its so-called salability. So how well can you sell it? And the ease of being able to be sold, combined with the least loss in price over time, is what determines what gets accepted as a medium of exchange, what becomes money. So this is not something somebody just decides, well, we're going to use this money. So it's actually the thing that is the most practical. And the most practical thing is always determined by these three factors. And so there's not really any right or wrong, like this is good money, this is bad money, although he later talks about easy money and hard money. But he says there's not really any right or wrong. It's more about how well do these different competitors, these different goods, address the three facets of the problem of lack of coincidence of wants. This sounds a little complicated, but basically it's just about the question, how well is the salability of these goods in relation to scales? So that was the number one. How well can you divide this thing down? If you just trade with cattle, for example, like it has been done before, it's very difficult to just break down a cattle in smaller and smaller pieces, right? So then you have, like, if you maybe just want to buy an orange, so you have this little tiny piece of meat, or how do you do it? So the scalability issue, so that needs to be really easily dividable if a money is to be used on a wide scale. And then of course it needs to be easily transportable. That's the issue of space. You need a medium of exchange that you can take to different countries, that you can move along easily. If it's too heavy or if it's too big, it's a huge problem. And the third one, of course, is the time aspect. So it needs to be able to hold value into the future. It can't just rot, or it can't just deteriorate. So I find this really interesting, to think about money as something that basically automatically addresses these three issues, and the one which addresses it the most or the best, in the best way, that's the one that actually people automatically start to choose as money in the long run. They might not first discover that this is the best good for money, but later on they will. Which he explains a little later. So then he says the ability to hold value into the future of this medium of exchange is the most crucial function. So that we have the medium of exchange, that's number one function for money. And then the second function is it is used as a store of value. So this medium of exchange is not only supposed to be exchanged, but it is also supposed to hold value into the future. Because what is it good for if you have a medium of exchange, but a week later this medium of exchange is only worth half as much as the week before? Then you won't use it much because it's basically worthless. And he explains that the number three, the second function of money, the store of value, that there has been, with a lot of different things, the problem that it actually didn't store the value into the future very well, because something new happened, like a technological advance. And I find this very interesting. He gives the example of, for example, seashells were used as a medium of exchange, and they were very rare. And so people could use it and could use it as a store of value because there weren't many around. But as soon as something changed, and I tell you what changed, then all of a sudden this thing wasn't worth a lot anymore. And what changed is, that's what he says, is it first has to be immune to rotting or corrosion. That's the number one for being a good store of value. So it can't just deteriorate. So everything chemical that or biodegradable is not a very good medium of exchange, not a good money. And the number two, that was the problem with the seashells. If it wants to be a good store of value into the future, it has to be able to its supply has to be able not to be increased too drastically. So the supply of this money cannot go through the roof just like that. If that happens, then the value goes down that quickly, because then there will be a lot of it, right? So that's what determines whether something is a good store of value, if you can't just drastically increase the produce of it, the supply of it. So the relative difficulty of producing new monetary units determines the hardness of money. That's a term he uses a lot in this first chapter, the hardness of money. So basically the question around hardness of money is always, is this a good store of value? And you can determine whether something is a good store of value or not if you know this thing cannot just go up in supply like crazy through no effort at all. But this is actually very hard to produce, and therefore you can know that when people use it as a medium exchange, and therefore the demand rises, and therefore the price rises, and therefore the incentive for producer to produce more rises, they can't just do it by will, right? So think about it with the seashell example. So you have people using seashells as a medium of exchange because you can, first of all, scale it really well, you can transport it really well, and in their environment, maybe some island, it's scarce, it's rare, so it's a good store of value. But then, because so many people use it as a medium of exchange, there's a high demand for it, and so the price rises. And because the price rises, all of a sudden, the producers of seashells, or possible producers, get incentivized to produce more because they think, oh, we can sell this then and we make money. We can exchange it for other things, so there's a gain for us. So what happens is, if there's a technological advance to get more seashells, maybe just by having a bigger boat to drive further to another island and to actually find more seashells or whatever, then the whole game changes and this money loses its function as a store of value because the supply can be increased very drastically. That's what he writes about, that oftentimes when there's technological advances, money changes because things that used to be rare are not rare anymore because people, through this technological advance, can produce more of it. But it's not only the supply and how fast people can produce this thing, it's also how much there is actually in stock. So there's a stock flow ratio that determines the hardness of money. If you, for example, take gold, the producing of gold is always only around 1 or 2% per year compared to the whole stock that already exists, because gold doesn't rot. You could just pile it up for hundreds and thousands of years. So even if they would really produce more in 1 year because they make a huge effort, the producers, because the price of gold is so high, because the demand is so high, they really want to produce more gold, and they go out and make double as much as last year. Then this flow ratio, so which they produce is still not really a lot compared to what is in stock. So the stock flow ratio has to be high for the hardness of money. If it's really low, and for example the stock is really little, and so if you only produce a little bit, you already have a huge market share, then you have a low stock to flow ratio, and that means it's easy money. And that means that it's a bad store of value, which means that everybody who used this money in their daily transfers actually loses money over time, which means they are not going to use this thing for a lot longer. And that is basically inflation. So the choice of money is determined by technological realities, is what Dr. Ammous writes. And he says that competition is always going on, and the reality is that the ones which use the hardest money will benefit most. They will automatically be the richest after a while. And interestingly enough is that this is often a process that you are not aware of right away. It's just that you use something as a medium of exchange, and then somebody else comes along and he either is able to produce so much of your medium of exchange that your medium of exchange all of a sudden gets worthless, or like printing money or whatever, and all of a sudden it's not worth anything, or somebody comes along and they are actually using another medium of exchange that they found somewhere, which is a lot more scarce, and automatically you will switch to this medium of exchange because you know this is scarce, so it will hold your value better. I think this is fascinating to think of money in this functional concept, in this functional mindset, to think what is the function of money. Okay, it tries to solve the problem of these different needs of human beings. They want to exchange goods through time, through space, and in different scales. And then it is used as this medium of exchange, but also as a store of value. And then the third function comes to it, which is if something is really widely accepted as a medium of exchange and as a store of value, so as a good money, then it becomes a unit of account. So people will start to give to all the goods that they sell or that they produce, they will give the price in that unit, in that monetary unit. So all in a sudden, things become comparable. You can actually say, oh yeah, this costs $10 and this costs $100, and all of a sudden everything gets measured by the same unit, and therefore you can compare it, and therefore you can actually plan. And when you can plan ahead, because you know what the prices are and you know that they are stable because it's a good store of value, you can start to specialize, which means you can all of a sudden start projects that take a lot longer to produce. You can build things that take 2 years or 3 years because you know that, the wide acceptance of this money leads to a wide acceptance of everything being measured in that unit of account. So you can actually calculate your productions. You can think about, okay, how much will this cost me? How can I do my business? And then, of course, a lot bigger projects are undertaken, and society advances, and things get built that are not just for, I don't know, they don't just take a week, but maybe take 2 years or 3 years. But that is only possible if this is widely accepted, so you can use it as a unit of account. All right, that's it. That's the chapter 1. And I think it's really fascinating. And I know that this is the base for everything he talks later about Bitcoin, to understand how Bitcoin is related to these different functions of money, and especially to the problems money tries to solve. And then again, store of value is key. Store of value, number one, it is not, if it is a good store of value, it can't rot, it can deteriorate, but even more important, if it's a good store of value, the ratio of stock to flow has to be high, so it cannot be easily produced more of it. And that will become very, very important for understanding Bitcoin and how Bitcoin could actually assume the role of a money.